Well, why do we do 24/7 prayer? The early church didn't do it, or did it? Why do we do it in Kansas City? Why are many around the world embracing this practice of continual prayer? Well, I could tonight give you a biblical, theological, exegetical, apologetic for this, a defense for 24/7 prayer from the Bible. I could look at the amazing scene in heaven and say we want to see on earth what is in heaven. I could do that. Or I could look around the earth today and see the move of God that is happening around the earth. Not just with Protestants, not just with evangelicals, not just with charismatics, but with Catholics, with Coptics, with Orthodox. A move of God that is seeing night and day prayer across the denominations. I could do that, but because I'm the, as what did Mike say, the resident historian, it's fallen to me to give you a little bit of a history. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to take a little journey back into the past and look at several different times throughout history of where 24/7 prayer, continual prayer, was a practice of the church. Now, before we begin, if you're interested in any of those other things, the biblical apologetic, the biblical defense, or what God is doing around the world, Mike is actually going to bring out a book later in the year. But the best short little book, which describes all this and the history, I helped Billy out with this, is a little book called Until He Comes, and it's actually for sale in the bookstore. So if you need a little defense when you're going back home for your supporters to say why we do 24/7 prayer, this is a little 30,000 word book, shouldn't take you long to read, and I really recommend it. So, did the early church pray 24/7? Well, the preacher in Ecclesiastes is right. There's nothing new under the sun. What we're doing in Kansas City and what is happening across the globe right now isn't the latest church growth technique. It's not a fad. We're not doing it to keep up with 24/7 grocery shops, 24/7 banks. Although, I've got a little quote here from a Scottish Puritan called Henry Scougal, who famously said, "The worth and excellency of a soul is to be measured by the object of its devotion." And I think we have to question our values if we think that groceries and fast cash are more worthy of 24/7 devotion than Jesus. But day and night prayer is not new. It's been done before. And in fact, the truth is, as you study history, and hopefully we've got some historians in the audience, as you look at the great moves of God throughout history, nearly every one of them, if you trace them back, you find out it began with prayer. It began with fervent intercession. And so, it all begins with prayer. Well, let me take a step back. It all begins with Jesus. But all prayer is just talking to Jesus. And if you ain't talking to Jesus, I've got some other questions about your Christianity. And so, let's get one thing out of the way before we begin. No individual can do 24/7 prayer unless you're like some of those early kind of desert monastics who stayed up crazy amounts of hours and then they couldn't after a while. Nobody's ever argued that it's one person's responsibility. It only happens when an entire community prays. But the much simpler and harder question is, are you praying? Because those who say 24/7 prayer wasn't in the Bible, they're really putting up a smokescreen, because the real question isn't whether you can do 24/7 prayer. The real question is, are you praying? So that is where I'm going to keep coming back to tonight, because it's a personal question for all of us. But anyway, on to the early church. So the early church began with prayer. In the upper room prayer meeting, Luke tells us what they were doing, and he tells us what car they were driving as well. That's why I drive this car. They all continued, I know it's an old joke, sorry, I tried. They all continued with one accord in prayer and supplication with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. So they were all there in the upper room, and then the Holy Spirit was poured out, and then they didn't pray? No. Now, often when we look at church history, we look at the events, we look at the big famous people, and we actually fail to look at actually how people were living their lives. What was their day-to-day existence like? And so I want to ask this question. If you were in the early church, you were one of those 3,000 that were ushered into the kingdom on that day one in Pentecost, what would your life look like? Would prayer be a main feature of that life in that early, explosive New Testament community? I think you know where I'm going, but anyway. And the answer is, of course. And the New Testament church was a praying church. A culture of prayer permeated the church. Now, we're told in Acts 2:42 that after Pentecost, the early church was characterized by 4 activities. And this is something that we should all look at. If you've got a little small group, if you've got a church, what were the activities that the early church devoted themselves to? 4 things: the apostles' teaching, fellowship, the breaking of bread, and prayer. Now, I'd encourage you in a separate Bible study, go deep in all of those different areas, because all of those should be components of the normal life of a spiritual community if we are, living out what Jesus would call us to live out. But let's look at the last one, prayer. Prayer was one of these devoted activities. But what did it look like? How often did they pray? And where did they pray? How much time did they spend praying? Because they didn't do 24/7 prayer. We all know that. Well, let's have a look. The first place they prayed, the Jerusalem temple. Now, as Gentile believers, we can have a tendency to downplay the prominence and the role of the Jerusalem temple. Why? Because Jesus himself took the place of the temple. The temple fell in 70 AD. The sacrifices in the temple were Jesus' sacrifice took the place of those sacrifices were taking place. But let's take a step back. Jesus walked into the temple. He was angry with the money changers. And what did he say? My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. What was he referring to? He was referring to the temple. He was in the Gentile court there, and he said, you guys need to be praying here. And so we find that after Pentecost happened, did the early church pray in the temple? And the answer is yes. Peter walked up to the gate beautiful. What was he about to do? He was about to walk into the temple and pray at the Jewish time of prayer. Now, the Jewish times of prayer, 2 or 3 times a day, they coincided with the time of the sacrifice. And so we find, Daniel, when he's in exile, he prays those 3 times a day at the 3 times of Jewish prayer. But Peter and Paul and the rest of the disciples would go into the temple. But more than that, the early church, and we know this from Anna, she was in there night and day with fastings. And this is in essence, a 24/7 house of prayer, right in the middle of Jerusalem, right in the middle of the early church's activities. And the early church didn't neglect it. Even though the leaders in the temple persecuted them, they went up to pray, they went up to preach, they went up to share community there at the temple. So the temple is the first place that they prayed. The second place they would have prayed, their synagogue communities. There were various different synagogue communities, during the Jewish exile, when they went out to various different places, to Babylon, to Assyria, to Egypt, to Damascus. They had a new invention there, and it was called the synagogue, the come together. And so we find in New Testament Christianity, the New Testament time, that the Jews would gather together on the Sabbath for synagogue worship. And the New Testament church would have been no different. They were Jews, and they would gather at the synagogue on the Sabbath and on other days to pray at the Jewish times of prayer. So we're building up a picture now. In the temple, they prayed. In the synagogues, they prayed. We're told that they met together from home to home, house to house. They met together as new believers in this messianic rule and reign which Jesus had inaugurated, and prayed to him from home to home. According to early church teaching called the Didache, it said that the early church, and this is kind of instructions and examples of how the early church worshiped, it said that they prayed the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. Now, just a little kind of bunny trail into church history. I'm not meaning to make this a lecture, but anyway. I'm not a Corey Russell. I'm a little bit more of a lecturer, so forgive me. But little bunny trail. During the time of Jesus, there were 4 Jewish sects. The Pharisees, the sad ones, they were sad, you see, the Zealots, and the Essenes. Man, I'm being too cheesy. Sorry, I apologize. Now, the Essenes actually were believers in the Messiah, believers in the age to come, and Jesus had disciples actually from all of these different sects. One of them would have been the Essenes, and when Paul says pray continually, actually the Essenes said pray continually as well. Many of the prayers of the Essenes we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they had this kind of eschatological tone, praying and waiting for the coming of the Messiah. It's my belief, and many other historians, that many of these Essenes actually, when Jesus came, actually just embraced Jesus. The Messiah has come. And now their prayer changed, but many of the features of the early church prayer looks very, very similar. They fasted on the same days as the early church. And so we see with the Essenes in their little community in Qumran, historians say that they initiated Davidic worship, which was continual worship, getting up during the night, praying through the hours of the night, praying through the hours of the day. So all of these different places they're praying. And if that wasn't enough, there was also what's called watching prayer. The early church remembered Jesus' encouragement in Luke 12, which says, "Blessed are those servants whom the master, when he comes, will find watching. Assuredly, I say to him that he will gird himself and have them sit down and eat, and will come and serve them." Now, by the 2nd century, it was very common for this watching prayer for many, many in the church to get up during the watches of the night, many at the midnight hour, because he might return at the midnight hour. And in fact, Tertullian, even he's a early church father in the 2nd century. He talks about this. He says it's very common. If you're a believer, you're going to be praying 5 times a day, at the Jewish times, at these times. And he's got this interesting little quote about, like, if you're a believing wife and you've got an unbelieving husband, you've got to be careful, like, not to wake your husband up when you're getting up in the middle of the night. And so 5 times a day and in the middle of the night. So if you're telling me that the early church didn't pray 24/7 as a community, I think you're wrong. And I kind of wouldn't like to be you when we get into the age to come and you have to confront the disciples. You're the one that said that they didn't have a prayer life, because I don't think that's right. Because what we see with the early church is a dynamic community. And we often think, oh, they went out, and they did go out, and they went out preaching the gospel and seeing signs and wonders. But they began their ministry. How did they begin it? Walking with Jesus, talking with Jesus. And when Jesus went to heaven, what happened? They continued talking with Jesus. This is the new dynamic of Christian prayer. we're talking to Jesus as divine. What a radical shift for these monotheistic Jews, talking to Jesus as divine and saying, come back, and walking in the power of the Holy Spirit. So they started with Jesus and they continued with Jesus. So that's the early church. Now you're probably thinking, 5 times a day? Wow. Sounds a little bit monastic. Sounds a little bit like a monk and a nun. Now monks and nuns are important to our story, but they weren't monastic. Now many monasteries were closed down in the 16th century during the Protestant Reformation. And because we're from a Protestant tradition here, well, actually here we actually do focus a little bit before the Protestant Reformation, but many Protestant churches do not. But it's a mistake, because for 1,000 years before the Protestant Reformation, if you said, yes, Jesus, I want to follow you, and you wanted to be radical for Jesus, what did it mean? It meant, wow, I'm going to become a monk. I'm going to become a nun. And so for that 1,000 years, well, even longer than 1,000 years, probably 1,200 years, these monks and these nuns actually formed the background of many of the moves of God in the church. And they formed the theology of the church during that time. So let's not negate the monastic tradition to the background. Now, they did a lot of, I'll say it, they did a lot of stupid stuff. And we have to learn from the stupid stuff as well as the good stuff as well. But we need to look at them because they are examples of night and day prayer that we need to study. So let's fast forward a few hundred years to a place called Egypt. We've got some Egyptians as imam. Any other Egyptians in the place? There's Boulez. Now, often when we think of Egypt, we think of the pyramids, or we think of modern-day Egypt, we think of this Islamic country. But many of us fail to look at Egypt with the rich Christian heritage which it has for many hundreds of years during the Roman era. And at the beginning of the 4th century, Christianity had undergone the very, very worst persecution that it had ever seen. Really, just horrible, horrible things that were done to Christians right at the beginning of the 300s. And suddenly, in 313, there was this massive reversal. 313, Emperor Constantine came along and said, Christianity has been illegal for 300 years, and I am going to legalize it. I'm not only just going to legalize it, but I am going to promote it. And so what we see is, there's a little slide up, if you can put that up, the little chart. Anybody awake up there? There we go. I don't know if you can see that. But the church was growing at a fairly steady rate. I mean, I think by the mid-3rd century, the 250s, one historian says that the church in Rome was about 30,000 members, which is a fairly sizable church. But suddenly the emperor comes in and says, Christianity is legal. And so not only that, but he does things like, hey, if you become a Christian, I'll give you 12 pieces of gold and a baptismal robe. So do you think many people became Christians? And probably not because they love Jesus. And so what you see is that chart that goes, and so the church is suddenly filled with mixture. And a church leader at the time complained. He said, the chief seat is gained by evildoing, not by virtue, and church leadership belongs not to the more worthy, but to the more powerful. And so we see the growth, well, really the birth and the growth of the institutional church. Well, in response to this, instead of displaying their devotion as faithful witnesses in the arena against the lions, many believers now withdrew from society. And they went out into the deserts, into the, these faraway places. And there was an Egyptian known as St. Anthony, who is seen as the father of those who fled society. And he's the father of these people that are called the Desert Fathers. He's perhaps the most famous desert father. Why? There's a picture of his monastery there in Egypt. A very kind of sandy, dusty, hot place where he was out there praying, fighting demons, as he says. But there was a very famous bishop at the time, a guy called Athanasius, who, we say the Nicene Creed on a Sunday often. Well, Athanasius was instrumental in the formation of that creed. Well, Athanasius went out into the desert and actually wrote this guy's biography. And as a result, Antony became a household name in the Roman Empire. Really, for about 1,000 years, Antony's biography really became the most popular book outside the Bible. Has anybody heard of that book? You can go and buy it. I think we have it in our bookstore. Need to find that out. But many then looked at these desert fathers and went, wow, amazing. They're living simple lives of devotion to Jesus, prayer, chastity or celibacy, obedience to their spiritual superior. And we see the famous preachers of their age, people like John Chrysostom, preaching to his massive congregation saying, look to the monks in Egypt. Look at their life of prayer. That is the epitome of what it means to be a great Christian. And so what we see in Egypt is thousands, nay, 10,000s of men and women going and establishing communities in the desert. And there's crazy stories. I mean, the father of communal monasticism is a guy called Pachomius. And it's almost like a story like, do you remember that movie, The Field of Dreams? He hears a word from the Lord, build it and they will come. And so he builds his monastery, and suddenly in the twilight he sees Cartlights coming over the hill. But he has 3,000 monks join his community. In other communities, 5,000. In other communities, it said as much as 70,000. And so one historian has said the desert became a city, given to prayer, given to simple manual labor. They would be there making the little ropes and praying day in, day out. And so here we have in Egypt some of the first examples of night and day prayer outside the early church through monasticism. Well, let's move on. The sleepless ones. Now, the Egyptian monks may not have been organized around a schedule of 24/7, but this next group were, and they were called the Order of the Sleepless Ones. Now, one of the conundrums that the monks in Egypt wrestled with was, in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, he had a thing which he said, pray without ceasing. And yet, at the same time, in the second letter to the Thessalonians, he said he worked night and day. So the question was, how do you pray without ceasing and work night and day? And this vexed the monks in Egypt. And so their response was, well, I'm just going to make a little rope, very, very kind of simple work, and I'm going to pray while I'm working. And so that was the Egyptian answer to that. But a few others had a few other ideas, and this guy, Alexander Archimedes, had an answer which we'll come to in a moment. Now, in 431, a church council, and church councils happen quite frequently here in these early centuries to determine what the truth was. This church council in Ephesus denounced a group called the Messalians as the most noxious heresy in memory. That's the quote. And Messalian means the people who pray. Now, I just want to preface this by saying this council was a really, really bad one. A couple of other things that they denounced as well. They said that the 1,000 years when Jesus comes back wasn't a literal 1,000 years. That's the council that they denounced there. Another thing that they denounced was they said Jesus wasn't fully God and fully man. So it was a pretty bad council. But anyway, the reason I mention this is because 3 years earlier, in 428, there was a certain guy called Alexander Archimedes who was driven out of Constantinople, which was the imperial capital, charged with being a Messalian. Whoa, big heresy charge upon him. And Alexander was the first group of monastics that truly organized themselves in a systematic way to pray night and day. Alexander believed the invitation to continual prayer and continual work was a corporate invitation on the whole church. And he said, some of us are going to pray, and others of us are going to work to support the ones that are praying. And so that was his answer. Now, Alexander was a pretty radical guy. He was a civil servant in the imperial capital in Constantinople. And like many other monks at this time, Antony was the same. He was challenged by Matthew 19. You know, Jesus' challenge to the rich young ruler, go and sell all that you have and give to the poor and follow me. And so he was like, that's what I'm going to do. And so then he went to a monastery. He was so radical that the first monastery he went to basically had a big blow up with the main leader, said, you aren't radical enough, I'm out of here. Me going to Mike Bickle, saying, you're not radical enough, I'm out of here. And he went to the banks of the Euphrates River, and a bunch of monks gathered around him, about 400 monks, and he said, we're going to split up this into 4 languages and sing praise to Jesus. So we had Romans, we had Greeks, we had Syrians and Egyptians. Now, to begin with, he said, let's pray at the Jewish times of prayer. So we'll pray 3 times a day. And then he's reading through the Psalms, and he reads Psalm 119, 164. 7 times a day I will praise thee, O Lord. And he's like, let's do that. 7 times a day I will praise thee, O Lord. And so he creates 7 times a day. And actually, if you're familiar a little bit with monasticism, this then actually came into the West, into the Benedictine order as the divine office. The sex, the non, the vespers, the different times when most monks throughout history have prayed during those 7 times a day. Actually, at Bangor, they prayed those 7 times a day. But anyway, there's Alexander reading his Bible again. And he's reading the first Psalm. And he's saying, wow, this guy in the first Psalm, he's meditating on the law of the Lord day and night. And he's like, that's what we need to do. We need to meditate on the word and sing praise to Jesus 24/7. And this is the quote that he says. He describes it in this way. My Christ in his creation allotted 24 hours of day and night. So let us pass the course of the day and night with 24 services, singing hymns to God. And that is what he did. He got his 4 different languages. We've got all of our languages in the All Nations Prayer Room. And he said, you're going to sing for an hour. And then you're going to transition. He was very concerned about transition times as well. Real concerned. And if they got it wrong, he spent a long, long time focusing on that transition time. But they did that. And they did that for 20 years. And after that 20 years, he looks at his group of monks, and he takes 70 of them. He says, you guys have been faithful for 20 years. You're my most radical guys. We are going to go on a ministry trip, an apostolic journey, to the 2 big cities, 2 big Christian cities that are close to us. We're going to go to Antioch, which was a massive Christian city, and we're going to go to Constantinople, which is the imperial capital. And we're going to go preaching, and we're going to go singing, and we're going to go worshiping. It was a worshiping, moving house of prayer. And they went into these cities, and the people loved them. But the church leaders didn't love them. Because Alexander got up there and basically got in the face of the church leaders and said, what are you doing? You're political, you're loving money, you're corrupt. And as a result, he and his group of monks was thrown out of both cities. And so he went and he founded a monastery on the banks of the Black Sea. And the monastery just went on. And they sang praises to Jesus 24/7. And this order became known as the Sleepless Ones, or the Achametai is the actual name. And it grew. And, it began organic, but then organization had to happen, and learning happened around it. And a few generations down the line, a famous senator from Constantinople says, come back. to Constantinople, and they established the most famous monastery in Constantinople, a place called Studion, which really lasted until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So for 1,000 years, the most famous monastery in the imperial capital was founded upon monks who sang 24/7 prayer. Now, as time went on, it became known for defending orthodoxy and more based in politics and social change. But where did it begin? It began with prayer. The power of this group began with day and night prayer. And not only did they start, but they started to influence other people. And so it went into Persia, modern-day Iraq and Iran. And then it came into Europe, and there's a place called Saint Maurice or Agaunum in Switzerland, which is the first kind of example of 24/7 prayer in Western Europe. They started singing 24/7 prayer in 522, and that lasted until 900, almost 400 years. They're singing 24/7 prayer, choirs singing to Jesus, and saw massive, massive change. Now let's move on. The Irish. I hope I'm building up a story here, a case that what we're doing here in Kansas City isn't new. It's been done before. And I can easily say 300 years here, 400 years here. We've only been doing this for 15 years. Come on, folks. 400 years? That's like someone starting in when? The 1600s. That's a long time. But let's have a look at these guys, the Irish. Now, while many of the monastic movements wanted to escape the world, they saw the corruption of the world and they said, we're not of the world, we're going to go away. This next monastic movement instituted night and day prayer and saw it as a foundation to bring about societal change. The Irish married prayer and missions together, and mainstream historians, we actually have had a book for many years in our bookstore called How the Irish Saved Civilization, because they see these monastic Irish monks as the ones that saw the tide of history as Europe descended into darkness after the Roman Empire. And they say, how did civilization, how was it saved? How was all these amazing Greek and Latin texts saved? How was education saved? And they credit the salvation with one group, monks from Ireland. But let's have a look at these monks from Ireland. Well, how did they begin? Well, the first guy that took Christianity to Ireland, hopefully you know, a guy called St. Patrick, brought a very, very similar flavor of Christianity to Ireland that was being practiced in Egypt at the time. Just as the Roman Empire was about to crumble, there is Patrick preaching the good news, signs and wonders following him, abolishing slavery, and it's said at the end of his ministry, he had basically converted about a third of the tribes of Ireland. And because Ireland was never part of the Roman Empire, it wasn't affected so much by the fall of the Roman Empire. But suddenly this new vibrancy of life as Christianity came to Ireland, monasteries popping up everywhere, societal change. Now, one little story about Patrick is this called the Veil of Angels. Now, have you ever thought this? God likes places. It's kind of a weird thing to think, but every morning every day there's like tens of thousands of sunsets, about mountain ranges and beaches and sunsets, beautiful sunsets, and God sees them all. Have you ever thought about that as you on your vacation in somewhere beautiful, Hawaii or Colorado or somewhere? You think, wow, God sees this all the time. Somewhere in the world right now there's a beautiful sunset and God's looking at it. But God likes places. I'll give an example, Jerusalem, Israel. Actually, God chose the land of Israel before he chose Abraham. Go to a land that I will show you. I could digress, but I'm not going to. But one place I think that God likes is this place here. And on one journey, and this is a chronicler tells us about Patrick. Patrick was with his buddies, walking along, and he came to the edge of a loch in Northern Ireland. He sat down, going to rest for the night, and suddenly the sky opened up, and a vision that they beheld, and what the chronicler tells us, he says, they held the valley filled with heavenly light and with a multitude of heaven. They heard as chanted forth from the voice of angels the psalmody of the celestial choir. And Patrick was like, wow. And he called it the Vallis Angelorum, or the Vale of Angels. This place was a valley of angels singing. The heavens were open, antiphonal choirs singing back and forth to each other. And it was in this very spot that the famous Bangor Monastery was founded just about 100 or so years later. And it's from this spot that Heaven's Song reached into Europe and actually pulled Europe back from the brink of chaos and confusion. Now, who was it founded by? It was founded by another radical, a guy called Abbot Cumgall in 558. He had a very rigid monastic rule of incessant prayer and fasting. And it said when he died in 602, the annals report that 3,000 monks looked to him for guidance. And throughout the 6th century, Bangor became famous for its choral psalmody. That's what one of the rectors says. It was this music which carried the continent by the Bangor missionaries in the following century. Bernard of Clairvaux spoke of it, and he said the solemnization of divine offices was kept up by companies who relieved each other in succession, so that not for one moment, day or night, was there an intermission of their devotions. This continuous singing was antiphonal in nature. It was, this call and response back and forth. And this kind of rigid, hard life. Has anybody been to Northern Ireland? It's not the warmest of places. It's not the most easy of lives, but people were attracted. This is a hard life, just like they were to the monasteries of Egypt. And soon it became a famous seat of learning, a famous place of education as they transcribed the Bible and they had all of these books. And there was a saying in Europe at the time that if a man knew Greek, he was bound to be an Irishman. And that was largely due to the influence of Bangor. But it was also then a missions-sending community. And, they would send forth groups of 12 monks with an abbot, first to the west coast of Scotland, and we see the foundation of a place called Iona, a very famous monastery. Then to the north of England, a place called Lindisfarne, Holy Island. And then into the rest of Europe, and we see this Irish monasticism bringing massive societal change. Patrick was the first crusader against slavery and brought an end to slavery in Ireland, the only one before William Wilberforce. And we see this Irish spirituality really invading all of these pockets and actually bringing Europe back from the brink. But how did it begin? It began with prayer. And so throughout these years, we see throughout Europe revivals, monastic revivals focused on prayer. One of them would be Cluny. For 200 years, they practiced 24/7 prayer. And, over time, it would decline. And then God would choose someone else and say, talk to me. Raise it up. And we see then prayer, then followed by societal change. And I just want to, a quick word about social change. You could sit in the prayer room and think, what am I doing praying when I could be out doing? You look at the big problems around the world, and there are some massive problems around the world. Big social problems. The world needs clean drinking water. Massive, big problem. What about abortion? Massive problem. What about sex trafficking? Big. What about the widows and the orphans? Massive things that need our focus and our attention. I couldn't agree more. The gospel is all about social change. But the lesson of history shows us something startling about the big movements of social change. A secret that most historians conveniently overlook. For people see the social reform and they say the social reform, amazing, amazing, amazing. But what they fail to look back, just scroll back a few years and what you'll find is spiritual renewal. And they'll fail to look at the spiritual renewal which birthed the social reformer. And what birthed the spiritual renewal is always a people that pray. So if you want to bring about social change, my contention is you can bring about as much social change on your knees as you can. I would say more than actually getting out and doing things. I'm not saying don't get out and do things, but get on your knees first. Now, we look at this in Europe with the Irish coming and transforming society. We look at it then with the Benedictines that are coming up from the other direction. And few fail to see the spiritual heritage that the West has. Why? As a result of these monks. And so many people think that the values that we have in society in North America are just human values, when they fail to see that those values actually came from these Christians. And just a little quote here from a Tim Keller book. He says, in his history classes, John Somerville used to demonstrate to students how thoroughly Christianized they were. Even those who were atheistic or anti-religious, he would list the values of shame and honor cultures, like those of pagan Northern Europe before the advent of Christian missionaries, these monks, and include various values like pride and a strict ethic of revenge, the instilling of fear, the supreme importance of one's reputation and name, and loyalty to one's tribe. Then he would list the corresponding Christian values, which had hitherto been unknown to the pagans of Europe, things like humility, forgiveness, peaceableness, and service to others, along with an equal respect for the dignity of all people made in God's image. Many of Somerville's most anti-religious students were surprised to learn just how deeply they'd been influenced by the ways and the thinking and living that had grown out of biblical ideas that had been even passed on to them through complex social and cultural processes. His point was that much of what is good and unique about Western civilization is actually borrowed capital from a Christian faith, even though the supernatural elements of this faith have been otherwise neglected of late in the public sphere. So many today will look at the social reformers of, my home country, England. The William Wilberforces brought the end to the slave trade. Lord Shaftesbury brought an end to kind of raw capitalism in the 19th century by saying little kids shouldn't be down mines. Little kids shouldn't be working in factories. We need legislation to stop this. But they fail to go back a generation and look at the spiritual renewal that happened under John Wesley, George Whitefield. And if we take a step further back, it wouldn't be, and it's not beyond the bounds of possibility, that spiritual renewal under Wesley, how did it begin? It began in a prayer meeting in Germany that lasted for 100 years. So let's move on to this next one. A rich young ruler, refugees, and a 100-year prayer meeting. The father of the Protestant missions movement is often credited as William Carey. However, it was a group of radicals from Germany a generation before which inspired him. Started by a guy, Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, a rich young ruler born at the beginning of the 18th century, 1700, brought up in a very pietistic, which was a kind of a move of God in the Lutheran church at the time, community. And he says, in my 4th year, I began to seek God earnestly and determined to become a true servant of Jesus Christ. I've got a 4-year-old boy. I don't know if you'd quite say it like that. Anyway, this rich young ruler, destined for a place in the European courts, a lot of money. Some people say, he's one of the richest men in Europe. Came into contact with some exiles, some political refugees from a place called Moravia, and he says, come onto my land, and I'll give you refuge on my land. And so these guys came, and more guys came, these Moravians, and they formed a community called Herrnhut, or the Watch of the Lord. And as many transplanted communities, there was a little bit of friction in the community. So Zinzendorf says, well, I'll become leader. So he became leader. And suddenly, the Holy Spirit was poured out in their midst. And 2 weeks after the Holy Spirit was poured out in their midst, they said, we are going to commit ourselves to praying 24/7. 24 men, 24 women covenanted to pray hourly intercessions, so praying around the clock. And they were committed to see, I don't know if you've ever seen this quote before, the fire must be kept burning on the altar continuously, it must not go out. If you haven't seen it, maybe you're too spiritual for me. You're praying that much in the prayer room. But if you kind of just turn around in the prayer room, you'll see it on the back wall. The numbers committed to this increased throughout the years, and it would go continuously for 100 years. Now, this fire, this little prayer room in Herrnhut, was really the spiritual fire that catapulted the Moravians into their missionary endeavor. And it's crazy what they did in missions. When they got a vision for what God needed the Protestants to do, the Moravians to do, they went out. They did crazy things. They sold themselves into slavery, all that the Lamb would receive the reward of his suffering. They realized there's no returning for where I'm going, but the people that I'm going to need the gospel. I've got it, and they need it. But what was the beginning? It was prayer. And so we see this with the Moravians. And many people focus on the missionary activity of the Moravians, or some people focus on the prayer of the Moravians, and yet they fail to see that the two are combined. They're both parts of the same coin. Now, I could tell more stories about the 1857 revival, about the Welsh revival. How did it begin? It all began with prayer. But as we finish tonight, I just want to tell a few stories about a program that I'm actually making at the moment for Trinity Broadcasting Network, a program called Call to All TV. And I've had a great opportunities to talk to men and women of God throughout my life. And this program is another example of times where I get to sit down with leaders and quiz them for long periods, and then I get to throw in my own issues as well to see what they say. And so in this new series that I'm doing for Trinity Broadcasting Network, you can actually go onto their website and see the program, but I'm making a program about the story of YWAM and the story of Campus Crusade. And I love these organizations. I love the leaders. You know, as I grew up throughout my teenage years, my staple reading was revival history and missionary biographies. I mean, I loved it. It's what kept my heart alive. And I told the bookstore, I said, put out that Lauren Cunningham, Is That Really You, God? Has anybody read that book? If you haven't read it, read Lauren Cunningham's Is That Really You, God? And people are attracted to these organizations. Why? Why? Because they hear the story of people praying, hearing the voice of God, and then going out on a limb, doing great exploits for God. And now they look at these massive organizations today, and they say, well, if I want to do missions, I'm going to join myself to these two organizations. But what they fail to see is both of these organizations began with concerted corporate prayer. Looking at the story of Bill Bright and Campus Crusade. Campus Crusade do amazing things today in many nations of the earth. But as you're listening to the story, you're like, you mean it began with 24/7 prayer? Are you serious? I'm like, wow, new revelation. Bill Bright began in prayer and he ended in prayer. Prayer and fasting. Then, we move on to YWAM. And began with prayer. It's interesting. As I was interviewing Lauren Cunningham for many hours, I said to him, what do you see for the future of YWAM? I said, because I look back at history and I see organizations that began very fiery. One example, my cousin a few years ago was called into the YMCA to consult with him to see if she could give recommendations how to put the C back into YMCA. Because if you go to the YMCA today, you might have a good swim, but you're probably not going to be discipled and to have a fiery prayer meeting. But that is exactly how it began under George Williams in 1844. You go to the Salvation Army today, and there's some great Salvation Army guys, but as a general rule, it's really not the same vision that began with the booths 100 years ago. And so I said to Lauren Cunningham, I said, how do you know? How can you keep the DNA of fiery passion for Jesus? And because what might happen to YWAM is what happened to these organizations. And they're great organizations doing great social things, but they're losing their effectiveness because they've lost a little bit of their fire because they're not praying anymore. And Lauren kind of played the sovereignty card. He says, well, I see myself as a successor to the Moravians. I see myself as a successor to the YMCA and the Salvation Army. And God raises up men in every generation that will seek his face. And I want to be faithful in my generation, but who knows in the generations to come if YWAM will change? Who knows? And it's like, well, that's a good answer. So then I went to Joy Dawson. Anybody know Joy Dawson here? But fiery, fiery lady of God, very instrumental in the early days of YWAM. And I asked her the same question. And she kind of stopped. And she stared me down. And it's kind of a scary stare, Joy Dawson stare. I said, what's the future of YWAM? And she stares at me and she says, I don't know. Because she's been telling me stories for the last few hours about these amazing kind of stories of seeking the face of God as a group and then going and doing great exploits for Jesus. She says, I don't know. She says, if YWAM doesn't turn back to prayer, I don't know what the future is. Sharp intake of breath. But the truth is that the challenge isn't just for YWAM. The challenge is for us. The challenge is for me. If I want to do great exploits for Jesus, I must give myself to the place of prayer. And just to finish off, a little bit of my confession. You know, I came here to the Grace Training Center in '96. I used to come to the very sparsely attended prayer meetings. First prayer meeting I came to, I think there was 3 there. Loved prayer, but I wanted to make a great impact in the world. And so, anyway, did my law degree. I was working for God TV for 4 years, traveling around the world, doing actually pretty exciting things, meeting presidents, prime ministers, organizing big rallies. And I would come out here because my big brother Wes was out here, and I would lead worship and have a fun time because I enjoyed the prayer room. But I was like, I don't know if I can sit in this prayer room. I don't know if that's my life. And I don't know if I'm an intercessor. And so, you know, Mike would give his altar call, and I'm the rebellious. I'm always, you know, the son that says he's not going to go and eventually kind of does go. But anyway, and I'm like, I'm not going to go. And I didn't change until 2 encounters the year that I moved here. And one was in Nigeria. I was standing on the platform of an evangelist called Reinhard Bonnke, praying for sick people and seeing the most incredible, amazing miracles that I've ever seen in my entire life and ever seen since. I mean, people with like plastic eyes that could actually then see through the plastic eye. Just crazy, crazy things. And the Lord just kind of whispered to my heart as I'm seeing these amazing things and saying to me, are you doing this from the place of intimacy? Because there are many on that day that do these miracles that I will say, away from me, I never knew you. I was like, ooh, okay, I need to find the place of intimacy. And then I came back to England and I was leading worship for a guy, famous. He wasn't he was a potato farmer from South Africa. Has anybody seen that movie, Faith Like Potatoes? But so I'd go around with Angus. I'd lead worship in these real podunk places, and yeah, it was fun. I loved Angus, a great guy. And Angus was a potato farmer, but he was also a healing evangelist. But as I traveled around with him, I discovered something. Angus got up at 4 a.m. and he used to pray till 12 noon. And I was like, oh, God. Who am I to say I'm not an intercessor? This guy isn't saying he's an intercessor. He says he's a farmer first and a healing evangelist second. It's just assumed that if you're a Christian, you're going to speak to Jesus. And soon after I moved here, I was convinced Wes was the forerunner. I was the one that was dragging my heels behind me. But as we conclude tonight, I just want to ask that question. You've got arguments in your soul as you go and sit in the prayer room. Ooh, is this me? Is this not me? The question is, are you praying? Not whether we should do... The question is, are you praying? Are you seeking the face of Jesus? Because every move of God in history begins with a believer on his knees in prayer. Every move of God in history begins with a people who seek the face of God. And if we aren't doing that, what are we doing? In the words of Mike Bickle, amen, let's stand, but let's pray.